A resource that supplies drinking water to more than 30 million people is suddenly at the center of a growing geopolitical question. Not oil, not natural gas. Water. The Great Lakes contain roughly 21% of the world's surface freshwater and about 84% of North America's surface freshwater. More than 30 million people across the United States and Canada depend on them every day. And now, as drought tightens its grip across large parts of the American West, a new fear is emerging. What happens if the water-rich Great Lakes region decides that its water cannot leave the basin? Because despite what many Americans assume, the largest freshwater system on Earth is not fully under American control. Nearly half of it sits beside Canada. And a little-known agreement signed years ago may have quietly locked away what many desperate regions could one day see as America's last great water reserve. At first glance, this sounds impossible. The lakes are full. The taps still run. No emergency has been declared. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The crisis is not about water disappearing. The crisis is about who controls access to it when other water sources begin failing. And that story is much bigger than most people realize. Across the American Southwest, reservoirs continue to struggle under long-term drought pressure. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the backbone of the Colorado River system, remain far below historical levels. Millions of people depend on these reservoirs for water, agriculture, and hydroelectric power. Recent reports continue to warn about declining storage and ongoing shortages across the basin. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the country, an entirely different picture exists. The Great Lakes stretch more than 750 miles across the U.S.-Canada border. Lake Superior alone contains an almost unimaginable volume of fresh water. Together, the 5 lakes hold enough water to cover the continental United States under several feet of water. One region faces restrictions. Another lives in abundance. At first glance, the solution seems obvious. Move water from where there is too much to where there is too little. But this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Because legally, that water is largely off limits. And that's where the real mystery begins. Most Americans have never heard of the Great Lakes Compact. Yet this agreement may be one of the most important water laws in North America. Signed into law in 2008, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact established strict protections on water withdrawals and diversions outside the Great Lakes Basin. In simple terms, the water stays in the basin. Communities outside the basin generally cannot simply build pipelines and start exporting Great Lakes water. Any major diversion proposal faces an extraordinarily difficult approval process. One objection can effectively stop the project. That means the world's largest accessible freshwater reserve is protected by one of the strongest regional water agreements ever created. This changes everything. Because the debate is no longer about whether water exists. The debate is about whether anyone can legally reach it. And that raises an even larger question. Why was such a powerful barrier created in the first place? To understand today's situation, we have to reconstruct how North America arrived here. In 1922, representatives from 7 western states signed the Colorado River Compact. At the time, officials believed the river could support future growth across the Southwest. But later, research revealed a problem. The agreement was created during an unusually wet period. Water allocations were based on assumptions that proved overly optimistic. Multiple modern analyses now describe the Colorado River system as structurally overallocated. For decades, population growth masked the problem. Then, cities exploded. Phoenix expanded. Las Vegas expanded. Southern California continued growing. Demand rose. Water supplies did not. Meanwhile, concern began growing around the Great Lakes. Policymakers worried that future shortages elsewhere might trigger massive diversion proposals. By the early 2000s, leaders in the region were discussing how to prevent large-scale exports. In 2005, Great Lakes governors and Canadian premiers negotiated protections. In 2008, Congress approved the compact and President George W. Bush signed it into law. At the time, many people viewed the agreement as precautionary. Today, it looks increasingly strategic, because the pressure on water systems across the continent continues to grow. So how does this actually work? The visible event is drought. The hidden mechanism is geography. Water is not distributed evenly across North America. The Great Lakes Basin sits in one of the most water-rich regions on Earth. The Southwest does not. The Colorado River supplies roughly 40 million people across 7 states, but demand increasingly competes with shrinking supplies and long-term climate pressures. Many people imagine water as something that can simply be moved. But moving fresh water across thousands of miles requires enormous infrastructure, pipelines, pumping stations, energy, political agreements, environmental reviews, and enormous cost. That means water abundance in one region does not automatically solve shortages in another. The Great Lakes may contain immense quantities of water, but distance and law make that water surprisingly difficult to access, which leads to a deeper realization. The lakes themselves are not the story. The system protecting them is. The visible lakes are only the surface expression of a much larger system. The Great Lakes Basin functions as a connected hydrological network spanning 2 countries: rivers, wetlands, groundwater systems, tributaries, shipping routes, municipal water systems, industrial infrastructure. Everything is connected. More than 30 million people rely on this system for drinking water, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and energy production. This is why officials view diversions so cautiously. Removing water is not simply removing water. It can affect ecosystems, lake levels, fish habitats, navigation channels, coastal communities. The compact was designed around a fundamental principle: the Great Lakes are not a reservoir waiting to be tapped. They are an ecosystem that must remain balanced. And that reveals something important. The Great Lakes are not being protected because water is scarce there today. They are being protected because leaders fear a future where everyone wants that water. History offers a warning. Across the world, civilizations have repeatedly underestimated water stress. Ancient agricultural societies collapsed after prolonged droughts. Major reservoirs have fallen to record lows. Entire regions have been forced to rethink development patterns. But perhaps the most relevant warning comes from the Colorado River itself. For decades, the system appeared stable. Cities expanded confidently. Agriculture expanded confidently. Then reality arrived. Today, scientists and water managers continue warning that demand exceeds sustainable supply in many parts of the basin. Groundwater depletion has accelerated, and recent studies show enormous losses beneath the region. The lesson is simple. Water systems can appear secure for decades, then suddenly reveal vulnerabilities that have been growing underneath the surface all along. The question is whether North America is entering a similar moment now. This is where the story becomes much larger. At the local level, this is about water utilities and municipal supplies. At the regional level, it becomes a question of population growth. At the national level, it becomes an economic issue. Manufacturing depends on water. Agriculture depends on water. Energy production depends on water. Transportation depends on water. And the Great Lakes economy already supports hundreds of thousands of jobs across multiple industries. But beyond economics lies an even bigger issue: migration. If water scarcity intensifies across parts of the Southwest over the coming decades, population patterns could change. Cities with secure, fresh water supplies may become increasingly attractive. Places once viewed as declining industrial regions could gain strategic importance simply because water remains abundant. The geography itself could become an advantage, not because the Great Lakes changed, because everything around them did. And that possibility transforms this from a regional story into a continental one. The Great Lakes are not running out of water. That is not the immediate concern. The unanswered questions are far more complicated. Will drought continue intensifying across the Colorado River Basin? Can future conservation efforts close the gap between supply and demand? Will pressure eventually grow for major water transfer projects? Could political tensions emerge if some regions become increasingly water-stressed while others remain water-rich?